I make this video in the aftermath of two events, which one isn't exactly in the United States, but it has bearing on the United States. And the other, of course, did happen in the United States. One is Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin. The second is the report by Special Counsel Hur on the case against potential case against President Biden in relation to classified documents. Now, I've discussed the interview that Tucker Carlson had with President Putin of Russia in my program yesterday, and on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I did a detailed 50-minute discussion of that interview. I've nothing to add to what we said there about the interview itself. I have noticed, however, an interesting fact about the way in which the media in the West has covered it, which is that, of course, they've been very averse to discussing the content of the interview itself, though they've made the utterly predictable comments about the long 30-minute lecture from Putin at the start of the interview on historical questions, which, of course, I discussed in the two videos I've just mentioned, my own and the one we made on the Duran. But other than that, which they haven't discussed the details of that lecture, just the fact that it happened. Other than that, they said virtually nothing about the content of the interview itself. Instead, what I have seen a great deal of is criticism of Tucker Carlson, including an angry comment, lots of angry comments about him, and perhaps a typical one is the one from the Financial Times by Gideon Rachman, which reads how Tucker Carlson became Putin's useful idiot. I have to say, I find this kind of commentary both pointless and ultimately offensive. Offensive not of Tucker Carlson, who's a tough-minded, grizzled veteran of this kind of thing, but of those of us who are interested in following the news and might be interested in understanding what is going on in the world and how it is, what kind of events are taking place there. Ultimately, this was an interview of the leader of a great power involved in an armed conflict with another country. The Western powers are not at war with that great power. We're constantly assured of that. So what did Tucker Carlson do which merits him being called these things? It seems to me that these comments, petulant and offensive as they are principally offensive towards us. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Now, the other big story, and it is a big story, is about Special Counsel Hur's reports about the president. I'm only going to touch on this very, very lightly. There's been much criticism from the usual people about Special Counsel Hur's comments. I've seen many people make the point that he is a registered Republican. He is, of course, also, it's important to remember this, an employee, an official of the Department of Justice. And he carried out an investigation. I don't see any evidence that he carried out that investigation in anything else but an appropriate way. He said that there was a compelling case, or rather a strong case, that might have been brought against the president, but he said that in light of the president's age and the infirmities that go with that, he felt that it was inappropriate to bring a case, and questioned whether a jury would have wished to convict. Now, that seems to me, I'm just saying now, a favourable decision for the president. I mean, I'm not entirely clear what exactly critics of Mr. Her would have preferred him to do, given all that he said about the potential strengths of his case. Would they rather that he had brought the case instead? Now, as to his comments about the president, about the state of the president's health, well, as far as I can see, he's told us nothing that most of us hadn't already been able to work out from the way the president has been conducting himself over the last 3 years. And if the Democratic Party has problems with this going forward into the election, well, ultimately they have no one to blame for that but themselves. Anyway, that's all I am going to say about these 2 episodes. It is concerning that the United States finds itself in a situation where the president is described, is headed by a president who is described in the way he is by Special Counsel Her. Some of us might feel that the problems that are accumulating in the international situation were predictable, given the kind of things that Special Counsel Her says about the president. But as I've pointed out in many programs which we've made, both on the Duran and on this channel, the current administration is effectively a team of people. And though the president constitutionally is the ultimate decision maker, it's clear that he has to lean very heavily on his staff in order to make whatever decision the administration needs to make at any particular point in time. That undoubtedly creates many problems. It undoubtedly leads to more factional infighting than is usual in American administrations, but there it is. Anyway, I'm going to move on now to discuss the situation with the 2 great conflicts that are taking place, and of course the most important news continues to come from Ukraine. And I think it is fair to say that there is considerable concern about the dismissal of General Zelensky. It's now clear that much of his team is also being sacked with him. There are lots of criticisms and comments about General Syrsky, the fact that General Syrsky is apparently an unsuitable person to exercise command over the Ukrainian armed forces. I've seen all kinds of terrible things said about him. I mean, he's been called General 200 and even worse things because of his supposedly profligate approach to the lives of his men and the equipment, the precious equipment that Ukraine has been provided with. Criticisms, by the way, with which I concur. It's also striking to see how members of his family are lining up to criticize him. It seems that his parents, who live in Russia, strongly support President Putin's government and the actions it has taken in this conflict up to now. So does his brother. I understand, and this must be a particularly painful thing, that his son is also criticizing General Syrsky and is also siding with Russia. I can't help but wonder what kind of a psychological pressure all this criticism from close members of his family must be causing General Syrsky as as he is now taking up the duties that he is. But anyway, nonetheless, the consensus is, and this is the spin we've been given, that in the present difficult situation that Ukraine is in, a tough, hard, ruthless, aggressive general is what Ukraine needs, and it's supposedly got it in General Syrsky. The fact that he will defend grimly every position, that he will go on the attack wherever he can, that supposedly is what the situation calls for. I completely disagree. It seems to me that is diametrically contrary to the advice the administration, the United States, supposedly is giving to Ukraine, which is the 2024 should be the year of defense and building up rather than the year in which to stage offensives. But anyway, a lot of the commentary has now fallen into line with this new narrative. One senses that a lot of people have doubts, but they've chosen to suppress those doubts and to say to themselves, General Syrsky is obviously the right man for the job at this time. Within Ukraine itself, one senses that the feeling is different. Now, there have been scattered minor protests, principally by women on Maidan Square, but nothing that could remotely amount to a concerted challenge to the Ukrainian government. But I've seen on Slavyangrad rather painful film of a hall full of women in a town somewhere in western Ukraine. They're being addressed by some kind of military officer. The women deeply concerned about the fates and whereabouts of their menfolk. They start asking questions. It seems that they're not satisfied with the answers that they're being given. The officer is, from what I can tell, being deeply evasive in his replies. And I gather that this is now becoming the pattern right across central and western Ukraine, in the small towns and villages where the burden of mobilization has up to now fallen hardest. And I can't help but think that with the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, now gradually working towards passing the new mobilization law, and with all this distress already widespread in Ukrainian society, the appointment of a general who is not only an ethnic Russian with family in Russia, but who is also someone with a reputation for being heedless of the lives of his men, is going to worsen morale still further. Whether that is going to have any impact on the political situation in Ukraine is another matter. But it is interesting, it is notable that for the first time there is now mounting and open criticism in Ukraine from members of the Ukrainian political class of President Zelensky and of his decisions. I discussed how a couple of days ago the former president, Petro Poroshenko, made a speech in the parliament effectively demanding that President Zelensky stand down. There have been, I understand, further criticisms from the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko. These both, Poroshenko and Klitschko, being, of course, veterans of the Maidan protests of 2013, 2014. Indeed, Klitschko at the time was the nominal head of those protests. Zelensky was not involved. And various other commentators and bloggers and other people of that persuasion from Ukraine, the nationalist persuasion, these too are now increasingly coming out and are becoming increasingly critical of President Zelensky. And President Zelensky faces, therefore, criticism from what might loosely be called the nationalist right, but he's also facing criticism from Yulia Tymoshenko, the former prime minister and major political figure in Ukraine, and she, it seems to me, is criticizing him from a somewhat different direction. She was also to some extent connected with the first protests on Maidan Square, the Orange Revolution of 2004. She was, of course, in custody, in detention, during the time of the Maidan uprising of 2014. But anyway, she's connected to that, but she is also somehow independent of it. She is an independent political figure, and whilst it would be a stretch to say that she represents the sort of centre-left in Ukrainian society, people who are perhaps patriotic and wish to see an independent Ukraine, but who are perhaps less averse to some kind of a relationship with Russia, and who perhaps have a different perspective on economic and social policy within Ukraine. I think it's a stretch to say that Tymoshenko shares those opinions. I think Tymoshenko has whatever opinions suit her at any particular time. Anyway, at the moment, she could perhaps be said to speak for that block of people in Ukraine as well. And of course, she's now coming out openly and criticizing the mobilization law. So President Zelensky, who until fairly recently was not the target of public criticism from within the political class, now is. And it's important to say that one individual remains silent, and that is General Zaluzhny himself. We were told when the announcement was made that he had been dismissed, that he was being given a different post and was being kept on the team, but we've never been told what that post is. General Zaluzhny remains completely silent. He's not told us whether he's accepted this post, or given us any indication what this post is. He's been awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine, but there's been, so far as I know, no public ceremony at which he's been awarded it. He has remained stonily silent and, by the way, all but invisible since the news of his dismissal was confirmed. And one senses that he's biding his time, waiting to see how things develop, both politically and on the battlefields, before he makes his next move. For the record, I don't think he's accepted any post. I presume that if he had done, we would have been told by now what it was. And I think that, as I said, he is currently waiting to assess his position. It could be, and this will heavily depend on the situation on the battlefronts, but also on what help, if any, comes from the Western powers, first and foremost from the United States. We could be looking at a period of intensifying political crisis in Ukraine, with the appointment of General Syrsky and the dismissal of General Zelensky, all perhaps bringing together all of the discontents and concerns that one senses in Ukraine are festering just beneath the surface. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see. But to repeat again, a lot depends on the situation on the battlefronts. And here, the news gets grimmer by the day. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the situation in Avdeyevka, and yesterday, the British media finally broke its relative silence on this issue. An article appeared in the Daily Telegraph about the situation in Avdeyevka, and I have to say, it told me absolutely nothing about the military situation there. It said absolutely nothing that a British readership would have discovered that was new and which have helped them understand what is actually happening in Avdeyevka. It was written by somebody called Colin Freeman, and I'm going to say straightforwardly, I found it a deeply misleading, mendacious, even propagandistic piece. And its title gives it away. It says, "Should this Ukrainian city fall to Russia, it will be America's fault." The words "it will be America's fault" are in quotation marks, and it's a quotation from a former British defense attaché to one of the Baltic states. And then the subtitle, which is equally mendacious, says, "Losses amongst Putin's forces on the verge of taking Avdeyevka have been extreme, but faltering Western support has weakened the defenses." And then we go on to read all the usual mishmash of things that we might have expected. Firstly, that the Russians are taking on the process of capturing Avdeyevka as a result of what are referred to as meat assaults. It's again the usual story of human wave tactics. The Russians, according to British intelligence, we are told, are losing nearly 1,000 men a day trying to capture Avdeyevka. There's no independent information or corroboration of this. I don't know where this figure comes from, presumably from Ukraine, but there we go. It isn't remotely plausible. We're told that Avdeyevka that Avdeyevka's value is symbolic rather than strategic. You may recall that back in October, various articles appeared. I don't think one appeared in the Daily Telegraph, to be honest, but I think certainly several appeared in the London Times and other places. Anyway, articles appeared in the British media assuring us of the enormous strategic importance of Avdeyevka, that if Avdeyevka was captured and the Russians were able to advance further north and capture the high ground just north of Avdeyevka, that would open up the way for further Russian advances towards Mirovgrad and Pokrovsk, to the northwest, or towards Pavlograd to the northeast. And if that happened, if Pavlograd especially was captured, then the Russians would reach the Dnieper and the Ukrainian forces in Donbass would be encircled. Now, I didn't say any of these things. I mean, I'm not expert enough to be able to come up with these judgments, but that was what the British media was full of. There was articles, to my recollection, about this in the Financial Times, in the London Times, in all sorts of other places. I have said in video after video that the sooner we got to the point where Avdeyevka was falling, the story, the narrative would change. Suddenly, Avdeyevka would no longer be a strategically important town. It would become of purely symbolic significance. This is just exactly what was said previously about Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, about Bakhmut, and of course, it's now being said about Avdeyevka. And we've now had an article in the Daily Telegraph that tells us the same thing. But of course, and this is, in my opinion, especially gratuitous, the reason the Russians are able to capture Avdeyevka is not because the Russians have a very powerful army, a very powerful air force, competent generals, any of those things. On the contrary, we're told that the initial assaults on Avdeyevka were a disaster. It is purely because the Ukrainians are not getting the weapons and equipment they need from the West, first and foremost from the United States. So they're short of shells, they're short of drones, they're short of everything. And it is this, supposedly, and this alone, not Russian strengths or abilities, not Russian competencies, not the massive losses the Ukrainians have suffered over the past 2 years of war. It is entirely America's fault, or to be more precise, the fault of the Republicans in Congress, which accounts for the fact that Avdeyevka is about to fall. And of course, we are not told what the actual situation is with ammunition production, shell production in the United States or in Europe at this time. We're not told anything about this. We're not given any wider information about the availability of stocks of shells. There was a long article about this issue of Ukraine being desperately short of shells in the Financial Times the other day as well. And again, there was lots of discussion about this and about the problems Ukraine is suffering in terms of shell production. And again, the entire problem, shell availability, and again, the entire blame was placed on Congress for supposedly not providing further aid, authorizing further aid for Ukraine. And the fascinating thing about that article in the Financial Times is that it told us absolutely nothing about the actual availability of shells to be sent to Ukraine in the event that further aid is indeed authorized by Congress. Now, let me say straight away that all of this is complete nonsense. J.D. Vance, senator, made the point that the United States provided Ukraine with vast amounts of weapons and ammunition in the first 2 years of the war. It massively equipped Ukraine for the offensive that Ukraine launched last summer. And it was during that offensive, which the Russians defeated, that shell availability began to fall short, so that the United States had to buy or basically borrow shells from South Korea to supply to Ukraine. And it was during that offensive also that the United States eventually had to switch to supplying Ukraine with cluster munitions in place of the 155mm unitary shells that it needed. And that had nothing to do with Congress. Congress, up to that point, was giving the administration all the authorization for funding that the administration had asked for. So, the situation is not because Congress is not providing further funding, it is because the United States, the Western powers, the Ukrainian leadership, including General Zelensky himself, massively miscalculated the military power of Russia. They launched Ukraine headlong into an offensive against prepared Russian defenses over the course of the summer, an offensive which the Russians comprehensively defeated and which has now resulted in a massive depletion of the human resources available for Ukraine in terms of its military, and which has critically diminished ammunition stocks in Ukraine itself, but also across the West. It was the disastrous mistakes that were made last year that has brought us to the situation that we are in. Had the advice of people like George Beebe and Jim Webb been accepted, had Ukraine, instead of launching that catastrophic offensive last summer, remained on the defensive and sought to build up its defensive power to resist the Russians, well, it might not have changed the ultimate outcome of the war, given the vastly greater resources that the Russians possess. But it might have left Ukraine in a much stronger position this year than the one it is in now, and would have bought Ukraine time to do that which George Beebe and Jim Webb advised it to do, which is to seek a negotiated settlement of the conflict with the Russians. But anyway, I'm not going to rehearse and re-argue all of these points. We can see the alibi that is now being constructed. The usual cliches, Russian meat assaults, Avdeyevka, a place of only symbolic value, and the fault not in Western production capacities and bad decisions, but in the unwillingness of Republicans in Congress to go on reinforcing failure. Anyway, let's now turn to the actual situation in Avdeyevka. And the situation, as I said, is becoming incredibly bad. All of the reports concur that the Russians have significantly enlarged the area that they control in central Avdeyevka. It seems that they have certainly captured this railway bridge. There are some reports that they've captured this motor depot, which we were hearing so much about. The town looks to me, from the various maps that I've seen, virtually cut in half. And it looks to me also as if the large numbers of Ukrainian troops concentrated in the southern parts of Avdeyevka, where they were lured by the Russian breakthrough of 2 weeks ago, when the Russians captured the Tsar's hunting lodge. Well, the position of those Ukrainian troops is becoming critical. All reports concur that if these Ukrainian troops are to be withdrawn and are allowed to retreat, presumably leaving their equipment behind, then the time to do this is now becoming desperately short. There are still routes that might make that possible. There are still small country roads and fields. And remember, it's still winter, so the ground is reasonably hard. There are still roads and fields through which these troops can retreat, though the Russians are present now in many places around. They are able to cover the roads with artillery and drones. The Russian Air Force is exceptionally active across Avdiivka. They're able to bomb positions across Avdiivka practically at will, and they're doing so on a massive and relentless scale. But anyway, it does seem as if a retreat from Avdiivka is just about still possible, though the window allowing that to happen is apparently small. But all the reports also say that General Syrsky has assured President Zelensky that Avdiivka, despite this gathering crisis, can still be held. I don't know any independent commentator or analyst, at least none that I know of, who agrees with this. But anyway, that's supposedly what General Syrsky has assured President Zelensky. And all of the reports say that General Syrsky is now pulling together such reinforcements as he can to launch a counteroffensive in the Avdiivka area to break through the Russian lines, to throw the Russians back, and in some way to re-establish the integrity of the Ukrainian defenses in Avdiivka. Now, there's been much commentary and discussion about this. By the way, I should say that Slavyangrad and the Military Summary Channel have been carrying many reports from the battle area by a Russian war reporter called Marat Hayrulin. He seems to be an outstanding reporter, and he is providing what seemed to me to be the most accurate information about what is actually going on in Avdiivka. I think I should mention him. But for analysis, I'm going to turn to two other commentators, Walterson and a personage who has written extensively on his Twitter thread about the situation on the battlefield, somebody who calls himself Armchair Warrior. And Armchair Warrior discusses why he thinks there is little prospect of this great counteroffensive that General Syrsky is attempting to carry out, why it is most unlikely to succeed. And he says this: the Ukrainian army destroyed in Bakhmut in 2023 was drawn from two sources. Early in the battle, Syrsky, who was the general, of course, commanding the defense of Bakhmut, was able to commit the remnants of Ukraine's second army, formed from mass mobilization of reservists in early 2022, which by January 2023 was sorely depleted and no longer capable of offensive action. That was the army that carried out the offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region in the autumn of 2022. Brian Beletic, at the time, on the New Atlas, pointed out how ruinous those offensives actually were as a result of the huge losses that the Ukrainians lost during those offensives, effectively irreplaceable losses. And, well, so it turns out, and this was the second army. The first army was the one with which Ukraine started the war, which is already massively battered by the Russians in the first few months of the war, and which was basically destroyed in the fighting in Donbass, in places like Mariupol, Popasnaya, and Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, in the first 6 months of the war. But anyway, the second army, as I said, basically smashed up in the fighting in the autumn of 2022. And to continue with what Armchair Warrior says, he says it was, however, still quite large, and I mean, it might have been badly battered, but it still had a certain capability, even if it was no longer fully capable of going on the offensive. It was still, however, quite large, and Syrsky fed battalion after battalion into Prigozhin's meat grinder in Bakhmut, to the point that mappers attempting to portray the sheer number of Ukrainian units committed and destroyed practically covered the city in unit icons. I can remember that there were times when there were between 20 and 30 Ukrainian brigades nominally operating in the Bakhmut area. It was an astonishing commitment to forces by Ukraine this time last year, and it was all for nothing, and those brigades were massively destroyed. And then it goes on to say this. This is what Armchair Warrior goes on to say. After Bakhmut's fall in May 2023, Syrsky was then able to draw on Ukraine's Third Army, the force largely equipped, trained and funded by NATO in an effort to reconstitute Ukraine's battered forces for what was intended to be a war-winning offensive in Zaporozhye in 2023. And again, about the creation of this Third Army, the best commentator, to my knowledge, has been again Ryan Beletic on the New Atlas. The overwhelming importance placed upon Bakhmut as a symbol of national resistance created a cycle of reinforcing failure, as Syrsky was able to divert considerable forces earmarked for the far more important Zaporozhye operation for a pointless and ultimately disastrous attempt to retake Bakhmut in mid-2023. And at the time, I discussed the tensions between the United States and the Ukrainians about what the Americans thought was this foolish, ill-advised diversion of forces by the Ukrainians to try to retake Bakhmut. I discussed this at length in previous programs. I'm not fully sure, by the way, that I agree with the Americans. But anyway, I'm not going to rehearse those discussions. And then Armchair Warrior continues, just as Ukraine's Second Army was destroyed, trying to hold Bakhmut, the remnants of its Third Army have already been crushed, trying to hold Avdeyevka. In other words, units like the 47th Mechanized Brigade, they're all thrown in, principally this time by General Zelensky, just saying, trying to resist the Russian advance on Avdiivka. The main area where these forces were attritioned away was not in the metropolitan area of Avdiivka itself. It was trying to resist Russian advances in the Severnoye Berdichi area to the northwest. That was a disastrous operation. And again, to continue with Armchair Warrior, there is no intact body of Ukrainian troops, no Fourth Army that in existence that can be committed in an attempt to break the claws of the Russian pincer. To the extent that reserves exist, given reports of extremely intense fighting and enormous Russian fire strikes inside and on the approaches to Avdiivka in the last few days, I believe they have already been committed and at least partially destroyed. There is likely a Praetorian Guard still available in and around Kiev, probably equipped with prestigious Western equipment that has proven politically difficult to lose in combat, like Challenger 2 and Abrams tanks, but I doubt this force will ever be committed in the Donbass. Conversely, There are a decent number of unengaged territorial defense forces securing Ukraine's unengaged borders with Russia and Belarus, but these troops are doubtless of very low quality and very poorly equipped by now, and their deployment would leave key border regions exposed. And in effect, what Armchair Warrior is saying is that there are insufficient reserves to relieve Avdeyevka, the Ukrainian forces in Avdeyevka, and committing what remains to that task is not going to achieve the objective, but it is going to throw away what remains of Ukraine's reserves. And this is where I now turn to Valterson, because with the skill of a trained military officer, which I am not, he explains that much better. He says this: small-scale attacks with squads would be the norm during normal times, but if you want to relieve Avdeyevka, you can't counterattack in squads. Individual counterattacks might not be above company level, but there might be a lot of those. If you pig-headedly repeat such attacks during a couple of weeks, you'll get huge losses, not only at the front, but also both close by and farther away as you move units forward. Those units will be attacked all the time and all the way. Ukraine has around 20,000 men on the Avdeyevka front, and Russia has around 40,000. If Ukraine shall have any chance to attack, they can't just use the units already losing the battle there. They need new reinforcements. There are not many Ukrainian reserves, so units must be transferred from other areas, weakening those areas. If we say Ukraine is able to scrape together 10,000 more men quickly, they will have 30,000 men available to attack, defend at the Avdeyevka front. After a couple of weeks, with failed counterattacks against larger Russian forces who have artillery and air superiority, most of these Ukrainian units will have lost their combat capability due to high losses. At that time, Avdeyevka will fall, with the garrison either captured or lost during a long and arduous retreat in a Russian fire pocket. That's the moment the Russians could counterattack, counterattack, and break through the depleted Ukrainian units with new high Ukrainian losses and a collapse of the Avdeyevka front. In such a scenario, Ukrainian losses of around 10,000 men are a modest estimate. If you lose 10,000 men, that would render units comprising 20,000 men to lose combat capacity. You normally say that you lose combat capacity if you lose a third of your unit. If losses were spread evenly, that would equate to that units with 30,000 men, in other words, a force of 30,000 men, losing combat capability. But since some Ukrainian units would be completely wiped out, I would deduct those numbers first and reach the number of up to 20,000. A flexible defense with a fighting withdrawal to new and better positions would be a much better option for Ukraine. By forcing Russian forces to be on the offensive the whole time, the loss ratio would be much better for the Ukrainian side. Defend until you risk getting encircled, then retreat to the next position. That is not as good strategy as during earlier wars due to different kinds of precision munitions that can hurt you severely while you wait enemy attacks, but it is still a better one than to attack against an enemy with artillery and air superiority. With an offensive strategy, the Ukrainians might have losses, at least 3 times Russian losses, but with a defensive strategy, that they might achieve parity under present conditions and buy time as a bonus. So, Valterson, who tries to be impartial between the two sides, he thinks that attempts to reverse the collapse of Avdeyevka would be disastrous. Armchair Warrior says it will burn up all of Ukraine's remaining reserves. And I say that such a strategy will simply accelerate and play into the Russian strategy of aggressive attrition, which the Russians have been conducting right across the front lines since October. Blaming the United States for all of this, or at least blaming Republicans in the United States for all of this, is ridiculous. The right thing to do is to withdraw these men now. Let Avdeyevka fall. If it is of only symbolic significance, well then so be it. Accept the blow and retreat to new positions and try and work out what to do then. And if Ukraine has any wisdom at all, begin negotiations. Alternatively, if you can't do that, well, at least you preserve your forces to fight another day. If, of course, Avdeyevka is as strategically important as we were being told a few months ago, then really, it seems to me, there is no logical choice but to begin immediate talks now, presumably trying to find mediators. The UAE is one possibility, Turkey is another, China conceivably is a third. Anyway, the situation, as I said, is critical. The Russians on the advance in Avdeyevka, it seems they haven't yet shown all their hand. Their forces in southern Avdeyevka are reinforcing. There's many expectations that over the next couple of days, the Russians will advance in southern Avdeyevka as well, in which case the remaining Ukrainian troops in central and southern Avdeyevka will be caught in a vice. Urgent decisions need to be made now, and all logic and all the advice from the military people like Valterson, say, pull the troops out now. Anyway, there we go. That's the situation in Avdeyevka. There's bad news for Ukraine on other fronts as well. There's reports that the Russians are making further advances in the village of Novomikhailovka, that they're capturing more territory. South and north of that village, they already apparently control around a third of it, according to some estimates, the eastern third of it. They're pushing steadily through Novomikhailovka. If they capture Novomikhailovka, that will increase the pressure on the fortified town of Vuhledar further south. There is now a growing crisis, apparently, in the Bakhmut area. The Russians have resumed their offensive towards Chasiv Yar. Again, we're getting reports, these are from both Russian and Ukrainian sources, that the Russians have captured a cemetery area to the west of Bakhmut. There are some claims that they've captured a forested area, the Popovka forest that I've been talking about. None of this is fully confirmed, but it looks as if they're about to attack this village of Ivanivska from 2 directions, and There's also reports that the Russians have resumed their offensive in this other village to the north, Bogdanovka, and that they're pushing the Ukrainians back there as well. Before long, there's a good chance that the Russians will have captured these two villages, Ivanivska and Bogdanovka, villages which the Wagner organization never tried to capture in the fighting that took place last year. Whatever Ukrainian troops are left trying to hold positions in Klishayevka, Andreevka, further to the south, will then have to retreat or face encirclement, and the road will be open for the Russians to push on, firstly to the canal, to the west, to the east of Chasiv Yar, and conceivably onto Chasiv Yar itself, if it is indeed their objective to capture that particular town and to move on to Konstantinovka and elsewhere. And further north, we're also getting reports. The Russians seem to be making the most concerted attack on Kupiansk that they have made up to this time. And there's reports that they now control a third of this village. Dima at the military summary channel said that they control 2 out of the 7 roads in this village. There's maps which seem to show Russian control of this village is between a third and 40%. And one gets the sense that the situation in this village is becoming disastrous, and that Sinkovka might finally be captured by the Russians before long. The Russians, of course, have made advances further south in places like Avdeyevka and those other villages to the south of Kupiansk, and it does look as if the Russians might soon be in a position to advance on Kupiansk itself. And according to various claims, they have 40,000 troops in the area, 500 tanks, 600 infantry fighting vehicles, and huge supplies of drones and other equipment, artillery and all that. And the Russians continue to launch missile and bombing strikes right across Ukraine. And yesterday, they were hammering Kharkiv, heavy Russian bomb and missile strikes on Kharkiv. Again, it's difficult to know exactly what it was that the Russians were attacking in and around Kharkiv, but it's clear that the Russians are now back launching strikes against this city, the second biggest city in Ukraine, and that it is now well and truly in Russian sights. And beyond that, we are also getting reports that the Ukrainians, short of men, desperately short of ammunition, this is now universally accepted. I would remind you again that Brian Beletic and I myself and others, Alex Vashinin, long ago, we always warned that we would get to this situation eventually, and it seems that we are now there. It's astonishing for how long Western leaders and commentators behave like ostriches on this question, burying their, well, metaphorical ostriches, burying their head in the sand, refusing to acknowledge the reality of the far greater volumes of Russian ammunition production. But anyway, we're now, it seems, at that critical point now, and there's been another article, I gather in the New York Times, that says that Ukraine is about to run out of air defense missiles. It will run out of air defense missiles, Patriot missiles and all of the others sometime in March, unless new supplies are sent. at which point the Russian Air Force will be free to roam across the eastern and central Ukrainian battlefields at will. Even if the F-16s are eventually deployed, they will be relatively few in number. They will have problems operating from airfields, constantly being attacked by Russian missiles. And to say it straightforwardly, they will be comprehensively outmatched. And again, talk about supplies of, the Congress authorizing more funding, but funding is not going to provide additional numbers for of missiles. Production of missiles remains in desperately short supply across the West, and with the United States tied down in conflicts in the Middle East, it's difficult to see that there is going to be an availability of missiles to supply to Ukraine that could make any fundamental difference in terms of this conflict. I have to say, this has been revelatory in some respects. The Russians, as I have discussed many times, launched their great missile offensive last winter against Ukraine with multiple purposes, but one of which undoubtedly was to deplete Ukraine's Soviet legacy air defense system based around the S-300 and Buk missile systems. And it took several missile strikes, it took multiple missile strikes over many months before that air defense system started to become critically depleted. We've had 4 Russian missile strikes since January, and already the Western supplied missile system based around the Patriot and the NASAMS and the Iris-Ts and all kinds of Frankenstein missiles, bringing together old Soviet launchers with Western missiles. That is already apparently all but depleted. Again, this episode has confirmed even more powerfully than I anticipated my long-standing point that the Western powers have never given much emphasis to air defense and to production of air defense missiles, because the Western way of war being based on air superiority, the possession of air supremacy, it has been very difficult for the Western governments and Western militaries to imagine a situation where they would need air defenses on the scale that Ukraine does, and therefore it's clear that they've not been able to help Ukraine in the situation in which it finds itself. And if the Western powers, over the course of a year, have been unable to provide Ukraine with a viable air defense system that was able to withstand repeated blows from the Russians, what prospect is there that they will be able to do so now with air defense missile stocks already depleted, and the Russian Air Force and missile systems waxing to ever greater strength? In summary, the war at the moment, the state of the war, resembles a fight between a lightweight boxer who has already been heavily beaten up over several rounds of fighting, pitted against a heavyweight boxer, vastly stronger and more powerful than himself. He's taking repeated blows. He's just about holding things together. But the knockout punch is probably only a short time off. Anyway, that's my assessment of the situation on the battlefronts. The fact that there is increasingly little news about the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine, in the media in the West, in effect tells its own story. And it is deeply depressing that even as the situation deteriorates, there is such a complete absence of debate about this crisis and such a catastrophic dearth of real reporting about how bad the situation for Ukraine has now become. Now, I said at an earlier point in this program that we could be drifting towards a political crisis in Ukraine if Avdeyevka and Kupiansk fall, if the Russians reach the Oskol River line, if Chasiv Yar is captured by the Russians, if the Russians start over the course of the next few weeks to press on Vuhledar itself, well, it could be that things in Kiev will finally start to come to a head, in which case it's difficult to know how the crisis will play out. But I see no sign that anybody in the West is thinking about that. And of course, if there is a political crisis in Kiev, it could quite easily spin out of control in ways no one, certainly no one in the West, but I suspect no one in Russia, and certainly in ways I myself cannot even begin to imagine. All of this with the big Russian forces still not committed to the battle, with reports of more Russian forces gathering in the north, with indications of a big Russian offensive from the north in Kharkiv region still to come. I'm going to finish, by the way, this discussion about the situation in Ukraine by commenting on admissions which have appeared in the American media that the Ilyushin 76 with the 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war was indeed shot down over Russian territory by a Patriot missile system. We're told that it was an early generation Patriot missile, not one of the Patriot missiles supplied directly to Ukraine by the United States, probably one of the Patriot missile systems provided by Germany or perhaps the Netherlands. I don't see why that makes any difference. The insouciance and lack of concern in the West about the fact that a Russian aircraft was shot down in Russian airspace with a Western-supplied missile, frankly astonishes me. And I noticed that France, which has been chairing meetings at the Security Council, has blocked all discussion there of this incident. Again, retreating into denials, trying to bring down the shutters seems to me a bad strategy as things fall apart, but that appears to be what the West is doing. Anyway, that's the situation in Ukraine. Now we're getting reports that there is going to be a renewal of the fighting in the Gaza Strip. Israel apparently is preparing an offensive against the town of Rafah, which is, as I understand it, located in the southern end of the Gaza Strip. It's likely that the fighting is going to intensify. There are various reports in the Western media now, including, I noticed one in the Financial Times, about dismay on the part of some Western officials that all attempts to agree a ceasefire, or anything even that can be packaged as a ceasefire in Gaza, seem to be failing, and that the conflict in Gaza looks like it's going to be intensifying, even as the United States continues its increasingly aimless missile and bombing strikes across the Middle East, which even the President of the United States himself, with respect to the strikes against the Houthis, admitted are achieving nothing. It seems that Secretary Blinken is again going to engage in one of his journeys to the Middle East. All of his previous journeys have amounted to nothing. It's not clear what he's coming with this time. On every previous occasion, he's come effectively empty-handed or floating catastrophic ideas, as he did right at the outset of this crisis in October, of decanting the population of Gaza into 10 cities in Sinai, funded by Qatar, ideas which all of the Arab states united in shooting down. So we will see what Secretary Blinken is up to. But coming back to my first comments right at the outset of this program, given the now acknowledged problems that surround the President of the United States, which must, to some extent, be affecting the administration's ability to make decisions and to chart a way forward, it seems to me wholly unsurprising that American policy in the Middle East, as in Ukraine, is now characterized by drift, with nobody, it seems, knowing exactly what to do. Well, there we are. Diplomacy requires a hands-on approach, acuity and skill, and it seems that the President and his team do not have it, and no one else in the West has it either. This is where I end my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all those wonderful things. I gather we have a sale, 15% discount on shirts at the moment, so don't forget to see what you can get there. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.